Welcome to the Stomping Grounds, the Play EDH gameplay series. This week we're honored to have Thraben U joining us for some mid-level EDH. Because of this, we thought it'd be fun to theme our decks around legacy archetypes. Thraben brings in Preston the Vanisher. With a deck themed around the Venture mechanic, his game plan is to flicker creatures and complete a whole lot of dungeons to win. Next we got Senatorius running Saskia the Unyielding. With a legacy lands inspiration for his deck, the game plan is to play powerful land effects and bring out big hitters as well. Then we have Smurs, bringing in Alusha the Infinite. Smurs' deck is a love letter to Stoneforge Mystic and other powerful red-white-blue staples found in Legacy. Finally, we have Once, playing Nicol Bolas. The deck is full of powerful discard and reanimation effects that you typically find in a Legacy environment. Without further ado, let's get into this mid-level Commander gameplay. Thraben starts us off by playing a Plains and then casting Altar of the Brood. Senate goes next and plays a Tiger, casting Exploration. For his second land drop return, he's going to play a Sacred Foundry. Smurs plays a Spectator Seating and passes. Once plays a Bloodstained Mire and cracks it, going to 39 to grab a Xander's Lounge. Thraben goes to his second turn and plays a Plains, which triggers Altar of the Brood, causing each opponent to mill one card. Then he plays a Pearl Medallion, causing each player to mill one more card. For Senate's turn 2, he plays a Verdant Catacombs. He sacks the Verdant Catacombs and goes to 39 to grab a Temple Garden, which will enter untapped, paying 2 life, bringing him down to 37. For his second land drop return, he plays Tomb of Yawgmoth. He casts Braid's Living Nightmare. At the beginning of his end step, Braid's trigger goes on the stack, and Senate chooses to sacrifice his Taiga. Each other player chooses not to sacrifice a land, so they each lose 2 life and Senate draws 3 cards. Smurs plays a Training Center, and then casts Talisman of Creativity. Once plays a Scalding Tarn, sacks it going down to 39 to grab an Underground Sea. He then casts Nightscape Familiar. Thraben plays an Ancient Tomb. This causes everybody to mill 1 card because of the altar. He then casts a Welcoming Vampire, causing everyone to mill 1 more card again. For Senate's turn 3, he casts a Ramanat Excavator. He then plays an Ancient Tomb from his graveyard. He then plays Targar from his graveyard for his second land drop return. He taps the Ancient Tomb, paying 2 life to cast Swiftfoot Boots. He equips the Swiftfoot Boots to the Excavator. At end step, Braids triggers again and he sacks a Taiga. Once again, nobody chooses to sacrifice a land, so they each lose 2 life and Senate will draw 3 cards. Discarding down to hand size, he discards a Mana Confluence. For Smurs' turn 3, he plays a Fiery Islet. He then casts a Soul Ring and then casts his Commander. Once his turn 3, he plays a Command Tower and then casts Oppression. Thraben plays a Plains, which will cause everybody to mill 1 card thanks to the altar. He then taps Ancient Tomb to cast Preston, discarding Solitude to the Oppression trigger. This will trigger Welcoming Vampire, drawing him 1 card. This will also cause 1 more altar trigger to be put onto the stack. He then goes to combat and attacks once with Welcoming Vampire. Once declares no blockers and loses 2 life. For Senate's turn 4, he plays a Tiger from his graveyard. He then plays a Mana Confluence from his graveyard for his second land drop return. He taps Ancient Tomb and casts Knight of the Reliquary. He discards a Command Tower to the Oppression trigger. He then equips Knight of the Reliquary with Swiftfoot Boots. At end step, once again, Senate sacrifices the Mana Confluence to the Braids. Everyone once again chooses not to sacrifice a land, so they each lose 2 life and Senate draws 3 more cards. Discarding down to hand size, at end step he discards 2 cards. Smurs' turn 4. During his upkeep, he casts Talisman of Progress, discarding Venser Shaper Savant to the Oppression trigger. Elsha prowesses triggers. He then goes to draw. During his combat step, he swings Elsha at Thraben. He declares no blocks and takes 4 commander damage. During his second main phase, he plays a Mountain. He then casts Supreme Verdict. In response to Supreme Verdict being on a stack, Senate activates the Knight, sacrificing Taiga to go grab Dark Depths. Supreme Verdict resolves, clearing the board of all creatures. On Once's turn, he plays a Mountain. He then casts Shieldred the Apocalypse. He discards a Rankle to the Oppression trigger. Thraben draws, losing 2 life from Shieldred. He casts Panharmonicon, discarding Phyrexian Altar to the Oppression trigger. Each opponent then mills 1 card thanks to the Altar of the Brood trigger. He casts Loyal Warhound, discarding basic Plains to the Oppression trigger. The Enter the Battlefield effect of Loyal Warhound triggers twice thanks to Panharmonicon, letting him search for 2 basic Plains, putting him onto the battlefield tapped. Each player will mill 3 cards due to the Altar of the Brood triggers being put onto the stack. On Senate's 5th turn, he draws, losing 2 life to Shieldred. He then casts Life for the Loam, discarding Painful Truths to the Oppression trigger. With his Life for the Loam, he grabs Thespian Stage, Taiga, and Command Tower from his graveyard and puts them into his hand. He then plays the Thespian Stage. He then plays Command Tower for his second land for turn. He activates Thespian Stage, making a copy of Dark Depths. Now this is where it gets interesting. Because Senate now controls 2 Dark Depths, he must immediately sacrifice 1 due to the legend rule. Senate chooses to sacrifice the original and not the Thespian Stage copy. This new Dark Depths has no ice counters on it and immediately triggers, sacrificing itself to create a Merit Liege token. He then equips the Swiftfoot Boots to Merit Liege. He then goes to combat, attacking once. Once sadly declares no blockers and takes 20. On Smurs' turn 5, he draws a card, loses 2 life thanks to Shieldred, then passes. On Once's turn 5, he draws and gains 2 life thanks to Shieldred. He casts Nicol Bolas, discarding Archon of Cruelty to the Oppression trigger. Smurs flashes out a dress down in response to Nicobolus on the stack, discarding Balan to the oppression trigger. When the dress down entered the battlefield draw is on the stack, he casts March of the Outer Worldly Light for 0, targeting the Merry Leash token as it no longer has hexproof thanks to the dress down. Smurs has no cards in hand to discard to the oppression. March resolves, exiling the token, then draws a card from dress down. Nicobolus finally resolves, but thanks to the dress down, no longer has his ETB discard effect. Shieldred attacks Senate for 4 damage. At end step, Smurs must sacrifice dress down. Thraben's turn, draws a card and loses 2 life thanks to the Shieldred. He then plays a Plains, causing everyone to mill 1. He then casts Teleportation Circle. He has no cards in hand to discard to the oppression trigger. Each opponent then mills 1 for the Altar of the Brood trigger. Thraben goes to combat and swings his dog at Senate. Senate declares no blocks and takes 3. At his end step, Teleportation Circle targets the War Dog to make everybody mill 2 from Altar of the Brood triggers. Senate then casts Enlightened Tutor, discarding Thalia and Gitrog monster to the oppression trigger, putting a Mox Diamond on top. Senate then goes to his turn, drawing a card and losing 2 life to Shieldred. He then casts Mox Diamond. He then discards Delina to the oppression trigger. He then discards Taiga to the Mox enter the battlefield trigger. He then casts Saskia, discarding Jessica's Will to oppression. When Saskia enters the battlefield, he names Thraben as the target for Saskia's ability. He equips Swiftfoot Boots to Saskia, but he decides not to attack as he would rather have a blocker. On Smurs' turn, he draws a card and loses 2 life to Shieldred. He then plays a tapped Sacred Foundry, and then casts Stoneforge Mystic. Oppression triggers, but Smurs has no cards in hand. With Stoneforge Mystics enter the battlefield trigger on the stack, Smurs thinks of all the cool artifacts he could grab. He decides to grab Jit, because, well, legacy. He then casts his Jit and equips Stoneforge Mystic. On once his turn, during his upkeep, he casts a Vampiric Tutor. He discards an opposition agent to the oppression trigger. He then puts a card on top and shuffles. He then draws, gain 2 life from Shieldred. He casts Windfall. Everyone discards their hand and draws 2 cards. Once gains 4 and everyone else loses 4 thanks to Shieldred. He goes to combat and swings Shieldred at Senate. Senate then blocks with Saskia. Damage resolves, destroying Saskia. Senate then looks at his hand and decides to put his commander in the graveyard and not the command zone. On Thraben's turn, he draws and loses 2 life to Shieldred, then casts Preston. Everyone mills 2 cards from Altar of the Brood. At his end step, he decides to flicker War Dog and makes 2 copies of it thanks to Panharmonicon. He grabs 2 more lands and causes a total of 6 cards to be milled from each opponent. On Senate's turn, he replaces his draw trigger with Dredge from Life of the Loam. During his first main phase, he casts Life from the Loam, getting Dark Depths and Thespian Stage and Taiga. He discards Xenagos, God of Rebels, to oppression. He plays Dark Depths and Thespian Stage as his lands for turn. Senate once again activates Thespian Stage, making a copy of Dark Depths. He then chooses to keep the new copy of Dark Depths, sacking the original. The new copy of Dark Depths has no ice counters on it, so it causes itself to sacrifice to create the Merry Leash token. He then equips Swiftfoot Boots to Merry Leash. Looking at his life total, Senate decides not to attack with the Merry Leash token past his turn. On Smurs' turn, he loses 2 life to the Shieldred trigger when he draws. He then casts True Name Nemesis. He discards a Monastery Mentor to the oppression trigger. True Name Nemesis names Senate. He then casts a Ponder. He does not need to discard to oppression as he has no cards in hand. He reorders the top 3 cards of his library, then draws. He casts a Prismatic Ending for 2 to exile the Swiftfoot Boots. He goes to combat and swings Stoneforge at once. Damage resolves and Smurs loses the Stoneforge Mystic. However, he does get 2 counters on Jit. During his second main phase, he equips Jit to True Name. On once turn, he draws and gains 2 life from Shieldred. He then casts Exhume, discarding Force of Will to oppression. Thraben chooses Solitude, Senate grabs Thalia and Gitrog, Smurs grabs Venser, and once grabs Archon of Cruelty. The original Solitude targets Thalia and the Gitrog monster, and thanks to Panharmonicon, it also gets a second trigger and decides to target the Shieldred. Archon targets Senate. Preston triggers, creating a token copy of Solitude. Alter triggers, causing everybody to mill 2. This token copy of Solitude targets the Archon and Nicobolus. Solitude enters the battlefield targeting Archon. Venser targets the Panharmonicon, bouncing it back to hand. Archon targets Centaurus, causing him to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, discard a card, and lose 3 life. Preston then triggers, creating another copy of Solitude. Alter triggers and makes everyone mill 1 card. Solitude enters the battlefield targeting Archon. There's a second Preston trigger that is also put onto the stack, making a second copy of Solitude. Alter triggers once again, causing everybody to mill, and this new Solitude enters targeting Nicobolus to exile. Once then casts the Talisman of Creativity. In Once's end step, Smurs decides to remove 2 counters from Jit to give the original Solitude -2/2, killing it. On Thraben's turn, he recasts Panharmonicon. He discards a Snow-Covered Plains to the Oppression trigger. Alter triggers, causing everybody to mill 2. He then casts Sad Robot. Oppression triggers, but discards no cards because he has no cards in his hand. Alter triggers, each opponent milling 2 cards. When Sad Robot enters the battlefield, it triggers twice, and he grabs 2 basic lands and puts them into play tapped. This causes Alter to trigger once again, and each opponent mills 2 cards. He then swings at Senate for 5 with his War Dog and Preston. At his end step, he targets Sad Robot with his Teleportation Circle. Sad Robot exiles, then returns to the battlefield. This triggers Preston, and thanks to Panharmonicon, makes 2 token copies. Alter triggers are then put onto the stack and causing each opponent to mill 6. With Sad Robot and its 2 token copies entering the battlefield, Thraben searches for 6 basic lands and puts them onto the battlefield tapped. This causes Alter to trigger once more to cause each opponent to mill 6 cards. The table then comments on the potency of Mono White Mill. On Senate's turn, he plays a Savannah. Senate then casts Eerie Ultimatum. Senate proceeds to dump his graveyard full of permanents onto the battlefield, and the table sees the multiple lines he has to win the game from this turn. So the players agree to concede the game to the blowout, that is, Eerie Ultimatum. Congratulations to our winner, Senate, and thank you, Thraben, for joining us on this mid-level game. Thanks to Alter Brood coming down on turn 1, each opponent milled a total of 42 cards thanks to its triggers, where Oppression caused players to discard a total of 17 cards. We'd also like to shout out Lotuscon. Lotuscon, with an incredible prize support structure, is looking to be the greatest in-person CDH event to date. With many of the best content creators, artists, and personalities in attendance, this isn't just a tournament, it's a celebration of the format. We'd also like to shout out Popular Front. Popular Front is an independent journalism outfit from the UK focusing on the world's underreported conflicts. You can check them out at popularfront.co, where you can find their documentaries and links to their podcast. What type of gameplay levels would you guys like to see? Battlecruiser, low, mid, high, max? Let us know in the comments below. Looking to play EDH over Spell Table, but worried your deck won't fit the group's understanding of a 7? Check out the Play EDH Discord for curated games of Commander. Need more EDH-focused content? Check out playedh.com for our library of articles. Links are in the description below.